Mm. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's office hours. I'm Jennifer Splansky Juster, Executive Director of the Collective Impact Forum. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope this finds you, your loved ones, colleagues, and community safe and in good health. This is our now third weekly chat as part of the Managing Change in Rapidly Changing Times series, and we're really glad to have you with us. How's everyone doing today? I'll tell you that for me, this is the week that it has sunk in that this is the current new state of new normal and a completely abnormal time. And for me, that's actually made this a tougher week. It's also the start of Passover, which is a special communal time for me and my family and community. So it's been both tough to do virtually, but also kind of neat to see how people are adapting traditions and connecting in new ways. So maybe adaptation is also where I'm coming from this week and something I'm thinking a lot about. And happy Passover to those who are celebrating. I know that you all are balancing a lot right now between your work and your personal lives, and so we're right there with you. It's also been a hard week to see more and more data about the impact of COVID-19 coming out. In particular, the data that's coming out from communities that are disaggregating their COVID impact data by race has been really tough to see. Though for many of us on the line that have been putting racial equity at the center of our work, this just continues to highlight the disparities and inequities that we know exist in our community and our society. Before we go further, I do want to take a moment to recognize the land that we are on. We'd like to acknowledge that this virtual coffee is presented and recorded on the traditional land of the Ohlone people, the Potawatomi people, the Coast Salish people, and the Duwamish people, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the Ohlone, Potawatomi, Coast Salish, and Duwamish people. So in this office hour series that the Collective Impact Forum is holding over the next few weeks, we're keeping things casual, and we collected some questions in advance, and we'll also collect questions from you all in real time. And we want to be upfront, as we have been in the past weeks. We don't have all the answers. As we know, these are uncertain and unprecedented times, but we're hoping to bring ideas of what we've been learning and hearing about and thinking about, and work with you through some of those questions that you are posing today. I'm going to orient you to our session just quickly. So we go for about 60 minutes. We have a couple of slides that we'll present up front, and then we'll turn to questions, and we'll do a mix of questions that you all provided in advance. And then you can also use the Q&A box to share questions as we go. Let's go to the next slide. So actually the other thing I'll say is we are recording today's session, so we'll share a recording after. So to ask questions, you can use the Q&A box. There is also a chat box, just to keep things all in one place. We ask you, please do use the Q&A feature rather than the chat feature, if you remember. If you need technical assistance, you can also email us at info@collectiveimpactforum.org. Next slide. So for those who have joined us before, you might notice that we're using a new platform. This is our first time shifting over to Zoom webinar. We used to use a platform called GoTo. So you're experimenting with us today. It's set up a little bit different. And so we are getting used to it, as will you be. So thanks in advance for your patience as we figure out how best to navigate this new platform. And just a disclaimer, GoToWebinar is a great platform, but our full organization has shifted, and so we're consolidating all into one platform. So that's what brought us over to Zoom webinar today. All right, next slide. So let's transition a little bit. We wanted to start by doing a check-in. And here I'm showing a check-in tool that our Collective Impact Forum team uses to check in with each other. It was created by my colleague, Tracy Timmons-Gray, who's running the back end of today's office hours. And we use this tool to help us name how we're doing in our current state, whether we're feeling anywhere from red through the rainbow down to gray. And we actually updated this tool from last week, and we adapted it based on feedback, adjusting it to be more holistic and inclusive of people's overall current state that considers not just one's work commitments, but we know that right now in particular, it's important to think about one's full life. If you think about your current state and how you're able to show up both with your family and your community and your colleagues. So this is a tool. You are welcome to use it in your work for check-ins with your colleagues and with your family if that's helpful. But we wanted to also experiment with doing a poll today and see how everyone on the line is doing. So I'm going to ask my colleague Tracy to let's see if we can get our poll functionality in Zoom webinar to work. Hey, there we go. So how are you feeling today? Red is feeling overwhelmed, stressed, or on edge. Orange, juggling many things, a bit difficult to focus beyond your main priorities. Yellow, you feel like you have lots going on, but you're managing. Green, you're feeling positive and balanced. Blue, sadness, depression, grief, or a loss of control. Or gray, maybe listless or bored, maybe numb to what's going on. So when you see enough responses coming in, Tracy, feel free to close that out.
Great, we're just a little over 50%. If anyone else wants to share out their thoughts of how they're doing.
All right, let's see. Are we able to share the poll results? Hey, yes, all right. So we have the largest number of folks reporting in at yellow at 42%, lots going on, but managing okay. Good to hear. And then I would say it's more or less a bell curve from red up through yellow and then down through gray. I think last time we hypothesized that folks in our communities that are in the red may not be on, have time to join our webinar today. But we're glad that those of you who are on are doing okay for the most part, and thinking about those who might be on the edges of that curve. So with that, what I'm going to do is actually welcome officially my two colleagues who are joining us today, Junious Williams and Paul Schmitz. For those of you who've been with us in past weeks, you have met Paul, and today we also have Junious Williams with us. So Junious is Senior Advisor to the Collective Impact Forum and is the principal of Junious Williams Consulting, Inc., a firm specializing in research, policy analysis, collaboration facilitation, program development, and assessment focused on increasing equity and justice. Junious has worked extensively over the past 25 years on a variety of multi-stakeholder, multi-sector collaborations and collective impact initiatives, providing guidance and support in design, implementation, facilitation, management, and program improvement, and many other things. From 1998 through 2016, Junious served as president and CEO of Urban Strategies Council, a social justice impact organization in Oakland, California. And then let me also just introduce or reintroduce Paul Schmitz. Paul builds the collective leadership of organizations and communities to achieve greater social impact through his roles as senior advisor at the Collective Impact Forum and CEO of Leading Inside Out. He's an author, speaker, trainer, and consultant whose work focuses on leadership development, collaborative culture, racial equity, community engagement, and result-based strategies. So with that, I'm pleased to pass the baton to Junious for a few brief opening remarks before we turn to our Q&A.
Thank you, Jennifer. I just wanted to welcome everybody and thank everyone for joining today. So good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'd also like to quickly thank Jennifer and Paul and Tracy and Sherry and Robert for inviting me to participate. It's been really therapeutic for me to be a part of some discussions that staff have had as we all try to kind of manage and navigate the new set of circumstances that confront all of us. I'd also like to encourage folks, if you weren't a participant in the earlier virtual office hours, that you take an opportunity to review those webinars and especially the materials. There are some really, I think, important resources, including the recent blog that Paul wrote, that I think would be worthwhile on your time. Today, what I want to do is to just share with you some frames, really, of how I'm trying to think about what's going on. It's not as organized as I would like it to be. I'm just having exploding synapses in my brain right now that have proven a little hard to kind of capture as concisely as I want to. But there are basically 5 frames that I want to share today, and they are reflected in the outline here. But I'm going to jump right in and just say a few words about each of these frames. So the next slide. The first kind of frame that I think is really important is reflected here is that it's not a single crisis. We're talking about it as if we're facing a single crisis, and certainly the COVID-19 pandemic is kind of the presenting crisis, but it's important to recognize that this is layered on top of a number of long-term American crises that we've experienced that are listed there. And they affected significant portions of the population in this nation, but we didn't deal with them because they were people of color, they were poor people, they were immigrants, they're homeless. And so we never labeled them as sort of national crises when in fact they were, and we ignored them. So now the COVID-19 crisis is layered on those, and as everyone knows, on top of some pretty frightening kind of global crises that we've also ignored. So I think it's important to recognize that we've got multiple levels of crises that we're trying to manage, and it's important to consider how all of them interact together. The second frame, next slide, please. The second frame is around caring for self, family, and community. And again, I would suggest you take a look at some of the prior virtual office hours. But I would just say this. First is that self, family, and community should be everybody's first priority, especially taking care of ourselves, because we can't help anybody else if we become ill. And I know from my own experience of having been in social change organizations for the bulk of my career, we're not the best at self-care. And we really, in this set of crises, need to lead by example and scheduling things for ourselves, keeping ourselves healthy, because we face a long road ahead and we're going to need everybody's strength and spirit to overcome these. And then finally, a message. I don't like the social distancing language. And I wish that perhaps we had used physical distancing, because at this point in time, given the technology and given how we're trying to connect with each other, it's really reducing the social distancing that we want to do and increase the physical distancing. And I think that's an important distinction, because the social aspect of this could easily lead to people being isolated. So one of the things that I've been trying to do is to just kind of check in with a friend outside of my household every day, not for work or anything, but just to talk to somebody, renew old friendships, and so forth. Next slide, please. The next thing I want to talk a little bit about, and again, there are other folks who've talked more about this from the forum, but the notion about hanging on tenaciously to what we planned 3 years ago is just silly. We really need to expect that goals and targets are going to be changed by these crises. And I would argue if you ain't changing up, then you're probably not practicing effective collective impact, which suggests that you don't ignore circumstances on the ground, lived experience, all of those dimensions, and forge straight ahead. Secondly, there's an importance, I think, in recognizing that collective impact initiatives have a valuable set of assets, infrastructure, to kind of convene people to work collaboratively that our communities are going to need during these crises more than ever before. And it's important that people identify, organize, and begin figuring out where to deploy those important assets. At the same time, the next generation of collective impact work is going to be more expansive than we've ever experienced. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But it's opening up the interconnectedness of many of these social issues, which in all too frequently collective impact, because of our focus on a single sort of intractable problem, kind of sometimes loses the interrelationship. And I'll get back to that. I've mentioned before, once you assess and understand what your assets are that may help, figuring out how to deploy those assets in terms of emergency response, recovering and rebuilding, and most importantly, the long-term structural and systemic and policy changes that I think we need to be talking about and focusing on. And then finally, it's okay to reconsider and adapt the common agenda to the needs and priorities of the community. Next slide. Yeah. So just a couple of ideas about collaborative management and communications, and you've pretty consistently, I think, gotten these messages from all of the sources, but I would simply reiterate them. We have to acknowledge the magnitude of the crisis, and especially the number of people who have been impacted by illnesses and death among acquaintances, friends, and loved ones in a way that in this culture we've never experienced. The sort of separation that people that are imposed on people just given the presence of the virus, and people passing away alone. So it's a particularly traumatic sort of time, and sometimes in the gross numbers, we lose a sense of the individual loss of life going on. A second thing is sending a strong message to people that it's okay, in fact, encourage for people to step back and to take care of themselves and their families, their neighborhoods, their communities. Third, there's got to recognize that in this distressing time, we're all experiencing a level of unrecognized trauma, and that all of us respond to trauma in different ways, and all of us have different needs in terms of the trauma. I think it's really important to just ask people what they want and need, and not to do too much presumption, and especially providing an opportunity to talk about and address kind of the personal and collective mental health dimensions of all of these multiple crises. The next point I would make is just one about the importance of structuring opportunities to participate in a collaborative work. And I just noticed I've got a typo there, but to expect that people are going to drop in and out, and to design around 1 week I'm available to sit in on these and next week I'm not. So how do you kind of create continuity and basically encourage people, if you need to drop in and out, that's perfectly acceptable. And finally, there's just this notion about, in the same way that we do in normal times of the past, figuring out how and what the different methods of engagement are that would suit the needs of different stakeholders, from just talking and learning to planning to kind of action agenda, so that people can figure out what fits them and kind of reconnect or connect in the way that's most appropriate. Next slide. So the next series of slides are really the fifth frame, and it's where I've been spending most of my time trying to think about. And at the center of this, obviously, you've got an obligation around collaborative management and maintenance. We've invested a lot of time and human energy and resources, and it's important not to let the infrastructure and the momentum collapse. So obviously, there is a high level of interest and importance to do the collaborative management. But I think there, in the other circles, concentric circles here, is figuring out how to use the collective infrastructure for emergency management is one sort of line of inquiry. Is there something in an emergency sense that we have as a collaborative that the community could use? Related one, in terms of applying knowledge and strategies to the emergency response. What is it that we've learned, if you're doing work on schools, about what we should be doing differently in schools that might apply to the emergency response that we make? The next level is, how do you apply, and let me step back for a moment. We're going to be in this for, I think, a while, where we're sheltering in place. When we start to emerge from this, there's going to be a recovery period and a rebuilding period. And I think it's important for collective impact initiatives to begin asking themselves where it is and that they want to deploy their resources, and how do they apply knowledge and strategies that came from their prior deliberative work to the recovery and rebuilding efforts that are going to be with us for a while. And then finally, there are two broader frames that I think are most important. One of which is, I think we need to reconceptualize our common agendas to include, I like the framework of social determinants of health, where there really is an effort to recognize the interrelationship of some of these social conditions and to work simultaneously on building healthy, vibrant communities, and not necessarily isolating on one specific issue. And then finally, and Jennifer mentioned this as we started off, and it's the other thing that's captured a lot of my time and attention in the past few weeks, is we really need to recalibrate the common agenda with a priority for equity. For people who work in the equity field, and have been doing this, we all knew that this was going to happen, that there were going to be the disparate impacts of this virus on different vulnerable communities that we have been trying to support for a long time. And I'll just say it this way, we're going to be in a period of rebuilding the basic structure and policy and systems of this country. And I would hope that we don't commit the same sin that the forefathers did of making that discriminatory and exclusionary. This is the opportunity to get the dream of America right, because we have an opportunity with all this knowledge and understanding of not recommitting the original sins of the country with respect to displacement of the native population, enslavement of people, exclusion of women from opportunities. And then the final slide, if you would, Robert, I just included a couple of slides around the social determinants of health. If you're not familiar with that framework, there are a lot of different constructs for this. I just offer a couple. Next slide, Robert. And then this is a slide that talks more specifically about within those larger domains of social determinants of health. And let me then conclude with the final slide and make the final point I want to make. Collective impact can start on any issue, but in the future, it must address the social determinants of health, education, and well-being. And even though this construct was developed around social determinants of health, I think it applies equally if you put education in the center, all of the factors that impact on educational outcomes. So my thing is, no matter where you start, at the top of it needs to be equity as the guide star or North Star, and you have to pay attention to the interaction of all of these social determinants and to not become so siloed and focused. And we've seen some of that. Education people have become food providers because the preventing issue for 30% of the kids in the nation who have free and reduced price breakfast, lunch, and snacks are all of a sudden without it. And people in the field who are education people adapted and now are working on food deserts and the fact that there's not. So I think that sort of thing that we're being forced into the interaction of these social determinants is something that we draw from at the end. And let me make one final point. My final point is that what we are doing under and to respond to this crisis, it shouldn't be just the crisis response. We're starting to do some things that we have known for generations we should have done in this country around how we take care of people that we have got to do. So it's not just giving people checks for a week. It's figuring out how do we make sure everybody has the basic income they need to survive. It's not just making COVID testing and treatment free, it's making healthcare free and available to everyone in the country. And I think we really, as advocates for all of these social issues that we work on in terms of social determinants of health, we should not make these one-time things, but we need to be thinking about the permanent architecture and infrastructure that we're going to reconstruct to revitalize this country and to make it live up to its promise of equity and equality for all the people. Thanks.
Thank you, Junious. Amen. Amen. I want to build on some of the, or ask you to build a little bit on some of the points you were making at the end around equity. And questions have come in around how should racial equity, disaggregating data by race, and other equity strategies play a role so resources are being distributed equitably. This was asked during the crisis, but as you're obviously making the point, it goes beyond the crisis.
For me, I think the first thing that people need to do is that we need to advocate. The fact that in this day and age, we would have started responding to a crisis of this magnitude and not systematically connect data around race, around nativity, around all the things that we know are elements of disparate treatment and outcomes. I'm sorry. Trevor Noah said on his broadcast last night that racism has turned out to be an essential service in America. And I think that's really poignant, that our longstanding history of racism and discrimination and our current practicing of it during the crisis. So I think the first thing that people need to do is advocate across your community, across the state and across the nation, that we are going to collect data on the demographic characteristics of the population so that we can practice targeted universalism, so that if some particular group is experiencing a disproportionately high negative impact, that we first of all know it, and that we can engage that community in figuring out with people with lived experience and expertise from that community, what's the way to attack this disparity in a way that's going to be effective. So the first thing is advocacy. The second thing is all of the data is that any data that we're collecting, we need to model that we're collecting it with data on demographic characteristics, and we're helping to educate our community of why we're doing that. We want to be able, especially as we move to this next phase, which is the distribution of the distribution of assets to people to compound this. The early signs are that the testing has been discriminatory and disparate for people of different statuses. And I shudder to think that if we don't do something and we don't build our resolve as a nation to commit to looking at how things are playing out by race and ethnicity and other demographic characteristics, that we're never going to get out of this. and we're never going to get out of this holistically as a nation. So those are the big things. We need to model the data collection that we want, and we need to advocate, and then we need to use that data and be comfortable saying, yeah, it's going to be different for different people, and that's okay. We will figure out what's happening to undocumented folks and what their needs are, and we're going to respond to that, because we may learn something that is universally applicable by addressing the needs of those who have been most disadvantaged and injured by these crises.
Paul, did you want to add on there?
First, I'll add amen. And then just in a more specific example, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where I live, 45% of all the cases in the county are African-American and 75% of the deaths. And it's the African-Americans make up, I think, about a quarter to 30% of the county population. It's the majority of the city, but this is county data. And so the reality is that the disproportionality of it, and we know that as Junious shared, that layering of the COVID crisis on top of the existing disparities, economic, health, and otherwise, educational, et cetera, means that those communities are being more disproportionately affected, yet the stimulus is not disproportionately supporting those who are disproportionately affected. And so I think that advocacy goes a long way. I know independent sector last week issued a call on the banks with a bunch of partners to really focus on small people of color run businesses and nonprofits as a focus of stimulus. I know that Speaker Pelosi talking about the next round has emphasized that. I think that it's just those who had the strongest bank relationships, which are often not in the communities with greatest disparities, were the ones who had fastest access to relief. And so I think that as we advocate and use our tools for advocacy, we've got to be making sure our health systems are treating people equitably. We have to make sure that the relief and support is doing that. So I think regardless of whatever issue we're working on, being an advocate for equity in our communities as they respond and as they build solutions for this is going to be important to make sure that we actually are building solutions that reach people who need it the most.
Thanks both. So a couple of questions are coming in here, and folks, feel free to share questions in the Q&A function on your webinar platform. So it says, Junious, how should collective impact organizations determine, maybe that's the backbone organization, determine how they best support their partners given the varied needs and, in many instances, lack of understanding from partners about what needs they might even have during this time?
Well, as I said before, I think the first thing is don't presume anything. And to really have mechanisms to engage people, I guess on a couple levels. One, I probably want to do some polling where I'm getting an aggregate picture from as wide an audience as possible. And then I'm going to kind of see what the patterns are there. And then I'm going to have some strategic conversations with some people who have identified various sorts of needs to figure out, okay, now that we understand that need, what's the best way for us to address that? As I said, I think one of the most dangerous elements of this right now is not to presume that we know anything, but to start everything off. And we're building a knowledge base, and that's good. But in my local context, I would want to start by, it's the same thing as people who practice cultural humility, which is being replaced with replacing cultural competence. It starts with the assumption that I don't know and about you or your culture, and I'm going to ask you. And I think that the parallel here is don't assume anything. Just start by asking people and then engaging people and figuring out once you know what the needs are, what the best way to respond to them are.
Great, thank you. A question coming in, I'm wondering about timing. I understand that every community is different, but I've been thinking about the outer circles, Junious, in your frame with the concentric circles. I've been thinking, so I've been thinking about the outer circles of shifting to less siloed collective impact and recalibrating the common agenda as an opportunity to advocate and change systems. And I think many on the line are excited to do that. And but wondering, is it too soon to be talking about this recreation of systems and collaborative in our communities when people are in emergency mode or just trying to stay above water?
I don't think so. And I think this is important. And every time there's a crisis, whether it's a mass shooting or something else, the reprise is always, it's not the time to talk. And when in the hell is it the time to talk about them? And my greatest concern is that if we don't look in the long term about what it is that we ultimately want to have in this restructured society, that we won't make the emergency decisions in the way that lay the pathway to get there. And one of the things that I mentioned earlier is not thinking about these as temporary. These are long-term structural fixes. So stepping back a little, and obviously we need to respond to the emergency, but we also need to have a vision for what do we want this nation to be? How do we want this nation to take care of its people, especially those who are most marginalized and vulnerable? And that those need to comprise the guide star and to think about the emergency relief in the context of where we want to get to. So in the healthcare context, it is that at some point as a mature nation, we need to take care of the health of our people. It's so fundamental and foundational that it's a little bit hard to believe that we haven't gotten there. But if we know that that's where we're going, then the way we structure how we respond to people who've tested positively and need treatment should lay the foundation for how are we going to make sure that those folks have health care services in perpetuity and not just to get them past this crisis. Because once they get past the COVID crisis, as we know, there are all these co-occurring morbidity factors that are still going to be there. The high rates of hypertension and diabetes and, respiratory illnesses and asthma, they're all still going to be there. So we need to think about the longer term as we figure out and to try to create bridges in the way that we do the emergency and the recovery response.
Yeah. Paul, do you want to add, or I can also go on to the next question?
Go on to the next question. I think I don't have anything to add to that.
All right. So how might we think about adapting or changing performance measures for our collaborative in response to or as a result of COVID-19? One thing I could share is, this is not exactly to performance measures, but how to think about approaching learning and evaluation at this time. A few colleagues of ours on the team at FSG recently wrote a blog on learning and reflection that I think would be great, and we can put that in the chat window here. And it really talks about being sure that you are taking the time for learning and reflection in this moment to see what is working and where you might need to be making adjustments. And in the near term, in this blog, they outline some questions around things that you might be posing as reflection questions in the short term, so within days and weeks. So how are we staying true to our commitment to equity? How is this showing up? What theories or principles are guiding us? What options are available, and what are the consequences of what we're doing in the near term? And what is going well right now? There are some other questions, and then they pose a set of questions that would be helpful to plan for reflection on in the intermediate term. So what did we consider, and how did we make our choices, and what are we seeing happening as a result of those choices? and then some longer term questions. And I think being intentional about what it is you're asking and reflecting on right now, and then doing some conversation, whether that is with your organization or as a collaborative, or if you're a funder, about your response to communities right now. It's about bringing intention to that. And so that, I know that's not giving a specific, list of indicators or measures, but what's more important is thinking about what questions will be helpful for you right now. And I think a role of philanthropy right now, and many funders are relaxing a little bit on reporting requirements and some of the more accountability focused reporting mechanisms. And we would advocate that that makes sense so that people can adjust what they're using their evaluation and learning energy towards, more about learning and adapting versus reporting for the sake of accountability. So those are a few reflections I have. Paul or Junious, anything you'd like to add?
I'll just add that I think the key thing is that you should expect that your performance measures, your strategies are going to be disrupted for somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 9 months. And if that's the case, then I think it's important to not get too caught into like, oh, geez, we're not meeting our measure, but figure out, kind of what's the best way to meet the mission and to meet the interests and needs of the people in our community right now. And then how do we migrate back both to the strategy we have, but also enhance them and update our thinking based on the new reality? Because what we're going to come out of this into is not March 12th. We're going to come into something, the next phase is going to be something new and different. And so I think that we just have to be very adaptive right now. I shared a tool last week from Marianne Urquia and the Center for Community Investment that I think is helpful for people to kind of think about, what do you prioritize? What do you pause? What's a new priority? What don't you know enough about yet to make the decision? What do we let go of? And I think we've got to, groups got to think through that and just be okay with the fact that right now, you're probably not going to meet the measures for the next few months and make the same kind of progress you were expecting. And because people need room, as Junious shared earlier, like we've got to give people space to do, I look at my own home. I'm the cafeteria staff. I'm a librarian. I'm a guidance counselor. Like on top of everything else, right? And so our lives right now are disrupted in a way that I think we just have to be okay with the fact that people aren't able to do what they're able to do before, and that's okay. And not get too stuck. I see a lot of groups still kind of in the zone of thinking about their strategies and performance measures, and you got to kind of like take a step back and realize we're in a unique moment.
Mm-hmm. And we, my colleague Tracy just put a link to Marianne's tool that you referenced, Paul, here in the chat window for those that are interested in accessing it. Highly recommend it. Maybe I'll pose this one to Paul. So do you have any insights on maintaining sustainability, momentum, communication right now, and really balancing putting things, how you engage folks and what you're engaging them around? So thoughts on energy, sustainability, momentum right now?
I think a key thing, and it goes back to a couple comments Junious said, was that first, to ask, I'm working with a client right now, and we're like, there's some people on the guiding team who want to meet. So it's like, well, let's ask everybody and say, will you have bandwidth in 4 weeks or so to do a meeting to move this process forward? And be honest and just ask people, because there are people who do have bandwidth. I have more bandwidth than I usually do right now, crazy enough. But some people have more bandwidth, some people have less. Just ask. I think then also figuring out, I think Junius's earlier point also, people might come in and out, and that's okay. And creating space for people to for people to some people, the Zooms work great. Someone in the chat space earlier talked about they're doing a lot of one-on-one meetings right now because People have Zoom fatigue. I mean, just so like really respond to where people are at, but recognize that, like, again, like be real about the moment, find out where people are at, and then adjust and figure out how to adjust around where people actually are at and how to support people, whether it's in group work or one-on-one work or giving people space or taking breaks, whatever will work.
Great. So many of us, here's another question. Many of us have July 1 fiscal years, so we'd typically be in the middle of budgeting right now. Thoughts on how to proceed with so much uncertainty? Create several scenarios with accompanying budgets. Any tools you would point to help with this? So you pointed to Marianne's strategy tool, but this is more around like budgeting and scenario planning. Any resources to suggest?
Junious, you got anything? Yeah.
Well, and it's on the Collective Impact Forum. I haven't looked at it in a while, but there was a budget scenario planning tool that was on the Collective Impact Forum website. This may have been a year or two ago. And the reason I'm raising that is that, boy, that to me is what I would be doing now, is a really good software tool that I could do probably a half dozen different budget scenarios, and being, I think, particularly attentive to distinguishing costs associated with backbone and infrastructure management versus programs and supports. I would also be thinking about whether, and this is going to be hard because the crunch for money is just going to be so tremendous, but I would run a scenario where I consider paying some of the smaller nonprofits to be at the table. That I think it's important for the tables to be representative, probably more important now than ever. And with small nonprofits, they're going to be experiencing, looking for resuscitation. And I think that we need to be conscious that, could we get funders to put a little more in the kitty? So I'm buying out a little of that organizational time to make sure that they're able to get staff or constituents, whomever, participating. But yeah, I would do a bunch of different scenarios, including a scenario of, what if I got everything I wanted? I don't think that we should ever stop doing that. That we need to know, if we could do all the things that we would want to do, our original agenda or the revised agenda, what would the cost look like for that? We have too often sort of had our own budget negotiations as nonprofits before we ever got in negotiations with whoever has the money. And I think it's important that we think expansively about what's going to be needed as we attempt to rebuild the society. And that's, I think, what we're facing once we get out of the immediate pandemic related crisis, where we can start interacting differently. We're going to need a lot of resources to redesign and reestablish civil society.
Yeah, and I know that I would suspect that many of you on the line are playing that backbone role and are part of that collaborative infrastructure. And I've heard, just in talking with folks, some fear that that funding is going to be at risk because it doesn't feel as responsive to the immediate crisis. And, I think on behalf of all of us, we would encourage you to really try to make the case for it's so obvious that collaboration and systems change is going to be even more important than ever going forward, and that the role you all are playing has always been and will continue to be as essential to enabling that collaboration to be effective. So the common agenda might look a little bit different and the focus might look a little bit different, but those skills and those relationships that you have built over time will probably be even more essential than ever. And so, yeah, we know that's a case that's going to have to be made.
And could I throw one other thing in quickly? Maybe some of us who have connections with powerful and influential people should get them to start arguing in one of the successive recovery rebuilding plans that there be money for this. I mean, um, foundations are going to be strapped, and I would expect them and hope that they would recognize the importance of collective impact kind of infrastructure and to continue to support backbone and other sort of infrastructure. But we've known from the beginning that that was never going to be sufficient and sustainable over the long term. Maybe it's time to have the argument and to get to people like Pelosi and other legislators who understand what it means to build community, to make sure that there is some resource that's allocated down at the local level that would provide some support for this kind of work. I would hate for all of this investment to dry up, especially because I think it holds the possibility of the solutions that we need if we work in this kind of way. So.
I just posted the art of scenario planning for nonprofits from the Global Business Network, which is a rather long piece, but it might be helpful to people in terms of tools for scenario planning around financial management and other things. I put it in the chat space.
Terrific. Thank you for the real-time posts. And I see a couple scenario planning links being shared, which is great. That's great. I think we have time for one more question. And sorry for the background noise. Our first two office hours touched a little bit more on this. And so I think this one I'll ask it to Paul. But how would you think about addressing and improving team and colleagues' morale during these times? A lot of people already have daily check-ins, but above and beyond that, what thoughts might you share?
I think the one thing is just to care about people as humans and to always remember the human side before you remember the action and work side, and to be empathetic and check in with people, whether it's one, and I think doing some one-on-ones if you have team members, not just on the big meetings, but check in with people. And if you are on a team call and people express that they're struggling in different ways, you can also check in with people afterward. And so I think just bringing the human element and leaning in empathy is really important. And I think as a facilitator or leader, just people knowing that people are focused on you as a person and acknowledging all the different things you're dealing with can help people feel a little better about what they're doing, and asking how you can help people on things they're trying to get done if you know that they've got other challenges they're trying to deal with. And I think beyond that, just continuing to kind of look for resources and provide people resources, but not overwhelm them with resources, to encourage them and look for things that might be helpful to folks, and share those. That's how I would think of it. I don't know, Junious, what do you think?
No, I like all of those, Paul. I think the only other thing that I would add is understanding kind of what team members currently do and maybe some of their aspirations, and whether or not in these emergency circumstances, it offers an opportunity because we're so short-staffed to give people a chance to try something that isn't within their normal scope of work, but that you need to have done, because it's likely that we're going to run short of folks. So I would look at that as another thing that might help with morale, that I've wanted to try to help with the communication stuff and it's not really my skill set. Well, maybe this is a good time to let that person pair with somebody who's in that and learn more about communications, but things that would excite people in terms of coming to work, and something exciting amid all of the other things that tend to be depressing around responding to all of these crises.
Great advice.
Yeah, and I
both.
think finding those quick wins
Yeah.
that make a difference in people's life. I think people know they're making a difference. That'll help too.
Yeah.
And thinking about those immediate ways. Yeah.
That's great advice. Thank you from seasoned leaders. Yes, very, very helpful. So I want to thank everyone that was able to join today. We have a couple super quick things we wanted to mention. So we are going to actually share, we're going to share a link right now in the chat box to our post-webinar survey. You'll also get this link in your email that has a link to this recording, but we really welcome your feedback and are always looking to improve how we support you all. So we'll put a link to our post-webinar survey in the chat box in the next minute. While that's coming, we just want to mention that if anyone is interested in continuing on a learning experience with us, we have turned our in-person event that was going to be in Minneapolis this May into a virtual convening. All the sessions will be hosted and broadcast in real live, May 6th through 8th, as well as recorded for those who are interested later. And then just one more way that you might find it interesting to learn with us over the coming weeks. We have recently launched a podcast. We are turning the audio from these office hours into podcasts, but also have several getting started in collective impact type sessions that my colleague Robert Albright and I recorded. And we've also turned several keynotes from past collective impact convenings into audio files that you can listen to via podcast as well. So feel free to check that out, and you can subscribe via your favorite podcast platform. So with that, thank you in advance for, as always, your engagement, as well as giving your feedback in our post-event survey. And with that, I want to say thank you to Paul and Junious, as well as Tracy and Robert, who are helping administer behind the scenes. And I'll give it just another minute for people to copy that survey link. But we are glad to have had you with us today. Thanks to everyone.